Amazing, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Again, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. As you can see, you can either access the captions on the Zoom platform or on the link, the West Caption link if you want to follow along there. Sorry, my YouTube of myself just went off. But thank you so much for joining us today for Imagining Cop-Free Communities, or teach-in, responding to anti-Asian violence in our communities without police. I'm Rachel Kuo. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the co-leaders at the Asian American Feminist Collective, who is hosting this teach-in. The Asian American Feminist Collective is a collective that brings together media organizing, political education, and community building projects in order to build towards collective liberation. Again, we have live captions tonight, which you can access by turning them on the Zoom platform or on the link that was shared. Before we begin, where I want to start is that while we are on Zoom and many of us are joining from different places, we want to remind ourselves that we gather on the unceded land of Indigenous peoples in New York City, where the Asian American Feminist Collective is located, and that this event is grounded in. We are on the land of the Lenape people, or Lenape-Hoking. The legacy of transatlantic slavery and the long history of anti-Blackness in the United States has also been tied to the theft of people to stolen land, which has been modernized to include the expansion of prisons and militarization of police occupying these unceded lands. Given this history, we are committed to the vision and practice of abolition to dismantle systems of policing, punishment, and militarism, and build up alternatives in our communities. Over this past year, we've participated in different workshops and conversations to grow our collective understanding of abolition. And often we've heard the question, what options do we have then if not police? And we see this question as an opening for possibilities. We convened this teach-in at a time where we have been seeing increased and ongoing incidents of anti-Asian violence, including the devastating shootings at massage parlors in Atlanta and at the FedEx facility in Indianapolis, as well as highly visible physical attacks on elders in public spaces. We're also thinking about ongoing police murders, including Angelo Quinto and Christian Hall, both killed by police when they needed mental health support. In August 2020, the NYPD created the Asian Hate Crime Task Force with bilingual Asian cops to address underreporting of incidents from Asian communities. In the wake of the shootings in Atlanta, the NYPD's counterterrorism unit, a unit that has military-grade weapons that were established after 9/11, deployed assets to Asian communities out of an abundance of caution. The NYPD has also announced adding Asian plainclothes undercover officers, where notably they had started disbanding these units last summer because these units often resulted in fatal shootings. The NYPD's hate crimes Twitter account continuously posts photos and surveillance video footage to seek the public's assistance in identifying and arresting people involved in attacks. And many of these photos that we're seeing are of Black community members. In several highly public incidents, the people arrested have been unhoused and or formerly incarcerated community members left without adequate support after release from prison, including access to safe housing or mental health resources. At the federal level, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was almost unanimously passed by the Senate, emphasizes the expansion of law enforcement through data collection, public reporting, training, and culturally competent public education campaigns. A lot of these culturally competent reporting mechanisms drive resource allocation to police departments for language translation. And however, language translation has already been tied to policing practices while not being offered to communities for public services. And so we can think about programs for strategic languages, such as Arabic, Urdu, and Farsi to police communities. The war against hate at home continues to build on existing carceral systems and war on terror infrastructures, where rooting out hate domestically is justifying ongoing militarized policing and transnational warfare. And so we're seeing cycles of violence continue to be perpetuated by policing and mass incarceration. And so we need responses that do not rely on systems of policing and punishment. And so this teach-in today offers organizing lessons and strategies from movements that have countered violence while also organizing for a world without police and a world without prisons. And so I'm going to turn it over to Saloni Bauman, who's a historian and AAFC co-leader, to briefly share thoughts on how we can reconceptualize care and expand our understandings of violence in this moment, and how we can think about exceptional forms of violence coexisting with everyday forms. And Saloni will also introduce our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Saloni. I use she and her pronouns, and I am a co-leader of the Asian American Feminist Collective. And I just kind of wanted to take a few minutes to sort of ground our presentation in thinking about or reconceptualizing some of the things that we have been speaking about over the last couple of weeks using the framework of violence or anti-Asian violence through a lens of care work, and how these bigger questions of slower economic violences, gaps in our social safety net, and real needs actually show up and might help us reframe some of these questions of exceptional violence when we encounter them. So I just kind of wanted to think through, we are able to recognize and see certain instances of anti-Asian violence or, communitarian violence as obvious violence, something like a shooting or an assault on the street. But often we don't necessarily think of those everyday forms of violence like eviction, like worker exploitation, like the lack of access to benefits many of our elders have, that many of our mothers have, people who really need resources and are unable to get them. Those are actually also processes of violent extraction, as I'm sure if anyone has ever been embroiled in those systems, you understand it and feel it as such. As a historian, and I think as many people would probably acknowledge, the social safety nets of this country were never really constructed to hold many of those people. It is not so much a failure of those social safety nets, but the logical conclusion of their construction. We have been thinking a lot about the struggles of home care workers at AAFC over the last few weeks, a population of predominantly low-income immigrant workers, most of them Black, Brown, and Asian women, but also men who are kind of doing the work of caring for aging people in community, and the ways that they're exploited by their employers, by the state, that their needs are not accounted for. And I, as a historian, was sort of reflecting on the ways that our laws have really been constructed to not include those people in our worker protections. So when we have certain ideas of the way a welfare state has failed people, in many of these kind of instances of racialized violence, we have people who are never accounted for to begin with. As we kind of think about all of the many issues that have really come to light in this pandemic, I think that we see both those instances of slow violence, and I'll just flag that that term was really coined by our comrades in the environmental justice movement to talk about environmental racism and the way that there's constant ongoing slow violence against many communities of color, and how they might actually, how kind of reframing around these questions of care might actually help us see what we have in common cause with other people. When we think about the moments of exceptional violence that have kind of prompted this conversation, we know that the people who experience them disproportionately are the people whose bodies are out and visible because of their economic status, because of their class positions. We see our elders, we see massage workers, we see service workers, and those doing the valuable work of recycling trash, collecting bottles, disproportionately affected by violence. And we also see people who are lacking in mental health care support, don't have access to social services, being scapegoated as the causes of those violences. So before I kind of segue, I did want to offer us care as a potential way to reframe these exceptional moments of violence and to think about a longer continuum of how we might actually provide support services that take care of people before they encounter violence and after. And I think that question of care is also really useful as we think about alternatives to policing. When I think about what I would offer an elder of mine, or we often get the question at AFC, what would you do if it was your grandmother, whenever we say that we are an abolitionist group. I'm sure that if any of you have discussed abolition with your loved ones, you have perhaps gotten a similar question, right? What would you do if it happened to someone you loved? And I know that anyone who's ever dealt with the police would probably have you know that that experience is not actually a very good one for most people. I don't know that I would wish that kind of interaction on a loved one of mine who had been traumatized by an instance of exceptional or slow violence. And so I kind of want to think through and consult our wonderful panelists who've been doing so much work on these issues about how we can actually take care of each other and what forms of care and reparative spaces we can construct if we really center those questions instead of questions of incarceration or punishment or retribution. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I hope you're as excited as I am to hear from all of them. So first, we'll have Moan Mohapatra, who will speak on the broader landscape of abolitionist organizing in New York City. Moan is an artist and organizer whose projects include Aid to Abolition, Sick of It, and Moan is also one of the original conveners of the National No New Jails Network. I am a big admirer of them and their work as well. Next, Vivian Trong will offer us the history of organizing against police violence. Vivian is a historian and educator from Brooklyn, New York, and her research focuses on the history of Asian American and multiracial movements against police violence in New York City. She coordinates a public history project on the archives of CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, where she formerly worked as a youth organizer and currently serves as a board member. Will Deepu will then give us deeper context on targeted violence against Muslim and South Asian communities in the wake of 9/11. Will is a community organizer at DRUM, Daisy's Rising Up and Moving, and leads DRUM's racial justice and men's gender justice network, and also co-leads base building work in South Queens. We also have Shahana Hanif with us. Shahana will share strategies to advocate for care, including language justice. Shahana is a Bangladeshi American Muslim disability justice activist and community organizer running to create a participatory feminist government and represent Brooklyn's 39th district in the New York City Council. You should all check out her campaign as well. Jason Wu will share queer-led organizing strategies and hate crimes expansion against hate crimes expansion. Jason is currently co-chair of Gifimni's Empowering Queer and Trans Asian Pacific Islanders. Their writing on abolition, housing justice, and social movements can be found on Truth Out, Refinery 29, Teen Vogue, and more. And finally, Kalayan Mendoza will share tips and strategies for community safety. Kalayan is a queer Filipinx and hard of hearing human rights defender, street medic, and civilian protector. He is the director of US programs for Nonviolence Peace Force. He has spent the last 2 decades working alongside communities in the Global South on nonviolent direct action, community safety, and mutual protection. So without further ado, I'll pass it to Mon.
I was on mute. Hi, everyone. Thanks again to AAFC for their consistent commitment to abolitionist organizing within New York City, as well as for coordinating this event, among many others. I'm speaking from Lenape-Hoking, where I live on the land of the Canarsie people. I'm Mon, I use she, her pronouns, I wear glasses, and I'm in a room with pictures behind me. I'm Indian, and I'm wearing a purple top. I'm going to be reading something I wrote before this event, so if I'm looking like not straight at the screen, just excuse me. Also, thanks for the compliment on the top. I try. My goal today will be to provide my general sense and understanding of the landscape of New York City PIC abolition organizing. It won't be exhaustive or sufficient, but I do hope to share a sense of possibility and opportunity within the work as someone who organizes from values focusing on solidarity, Black power, caste annihilation, and internationalism. Thanks also to Nathan Yaff and Rachel Ferran for helping me draft this. On the flip side of New York City's celebrated history as a migration port is one marked by capitalism and anti-Blackness. In the 18th century, the city's slave market was where Wall Street is now. A century later, Central Park was built over Seneca Village, a community founded by free working class Black people in uptown Manhattan. Around the same time, the modern NYPD came into existence to police Irish immigrants and stifle worker uprisings. It was soon after that that Rikers was built. Gerard Shanahan and Jack Norton Wright, Welfare Island, also known as Blackwell's Island prior to 1921 and Roosevelt Island today, was home to a cluster of institutions for sentenced prisoners, psychiatric patients, and the city's destitute. A progressive consensus began to coalesce around the idea that Welfare Island was in serious need of reform. Rikers Island would be that reform. I wanted to bring up the history of the city a bit to go to ground in the fact that not only has there been a long history of displacement, liberal co-optation of progressive demands, and reformism, but that people have been working hard to end criminalization and establish a jail-free NYC for a long time. Yet the mix of capitalism, land theft, expanded criminalization, and aforementioned co-optation have produced a situation where we now have in the city's proximity 4 juvenile detention centers, 5 ICE facilities, 5 municipal jails, a federal correctional facility, and 1 penal colony known as Rikers Island. And I'm sure I'm missing some. This is not even to count the other criminalized spaces, including psychiatric facilities, hospitals, nursing homes, foster care, and online. Meanwhile, NYCHA, New York City's public housing system, has reached new lows in terms of maintenance, and there are upwards of 120,000 unhoused people in the city. New York City's unemployment rate rose to 10% in 2020, well past the 6% national average. Instead of making public transit free, the city raises MTA fees by amounts that make the train inaccessible to many. Last summer, the NYPD beat and kidnapped protesters in the streets, but demands to defund the police were met with lackluster effort from the city council as well as outright gaslighting and apathy. Over 4,000 people are held pre-trial in New York City adult jails, with significant numbers of people on probation. When people are released, the prospects of housing, healthcare, job training, and emotional support are limited, and often themselves tied up with police. Despite the existence of the transgender housing unit for prisoners, many trans women do not get access to the THU, and largely New York City jails enact relentless violence on Black survivors and trans women inside. And with the hard-won repeal of 50A last year, we have an even clearer picture of abuse by corrections officers within the jails towards people inside. Reductions to the jail population made at the beginning of the pandemic have been undone, and the appeal reports New York City has people on parole in jails at rates not seen since the early pandemic. Disregarding serious needs for social housing, deinstitutionalization, and non-carceral economic support, the city's past many administrations and councils have been ruthless in their expansion of policing and imprisonment. Most recently, Bill de Blasio's police plan chose to expand criminalization despite massive protest, including increasing headcount and funding for New York Police Department. Notably, this plan claims to decriminalize sex work while focusing largely on punishing trafficking and not on the safety of survivors or sex workers. In response to white supremacist attacks against Asian people, city leaders like Margaret Chin choose to expand the hate crimes task force, even as Asian communities demand more resources, such as language justice within city services and non-carceral solutions and protections. District attorneys and judges continue to request and set high bail amounts and aggressively keep people locked up or actively block organizers from getting people out. There is existing evidence that NYPD and ICE cooperate despite laws to prevent this from happening. And in typical fashion, the NYPD lies about increasing crime to obscure the reality that jails and police do not prevent or reduce so-called crime. Upwards of $8 billion is currently still allocated to the building of new borough-based jails that will incarcerate many, many generations of New Yorkers under the guise of being better, more humane jails. Popular demands to close Rikers were manipulated into a plan that puts massive amounts of funding into maintaining incarceration. Renewable Rikers, for example, a bill meant to improve New York City's environment, greenwashes the jail expansion plan by legitimizing jails as a way to close Rikers. The city continues to move forward with its plans for jail construction with AECOM, a firm known for being chosen to work on the Cop Academy in Chicago. And only one current candidate for mayor supports closing Rikers without new jails. Officials connected to the city continue to lie or, as they say, hide the truth about the number of COVID-19 related deaths inside, but we remember Juan Cruz, Raymond Riviera, Joel Howard, Walter Antz, Kevin Del Rosario, and Michael Tyson killed by incarceration during a pandemic. People on the inside have gone on hunger strike and written that there is no air to breathe inside. And despite the havoc COVID-19 has wreaked within jails, Bill de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo have both refused to free significant numbers of people held without trial in the jails. People like Cynthia Brand, New York City's Commissioner for the Department of Corrections, and Elizabeth Glaser, former Director for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, ignored demands for releases and improved conditions. This is pure carceral cruelty. What we see from these events is that attempts within the city to mitigate the dragnet of policing are repeatedly met with non-solutions that encourage resources going towards police and jails, not survival, education, or housing. We can also recognize that the push for new jails is a part of a torrent of jail construction around the country, and current campaigns in Atlanta, Sacramento, Miami, and more are working to stop this from happening. We can't allow ourselves to believe a city with an abysmal track record of criminalization, detention, deportation, and enforcement to say that it can create new jails that will magically function better than old ones. But abolitionists have held the line that a jail is a jail and that no reform which drives funds towards police and prisons is a viable path towards ending the PIC here in New York City and around the world. New York City has been home to major rebellions and actions against the PIC, including in the honor of Eric Garner, Lillian Polanco, Khalif Browder, and Akai Gurley, among many others murdered by NYPD. Yesterday at a rally to free Prakash Churaman, I saw New Yorkers committed to ending incarceration. Participatory defense campaigns like the ones to free Prakash, free Tracy, and free Malcolm are just some that are using community defense to prevent reincarceration of our comrades. Campaigns like CUNY for Abolition and Safety and #AbolishACS are working hard to end police interactions that New Yorkers have. People are coalescing to say that anti-Asian hate is not solvable through policing and sitting through all-day hearings to demand ICE contracts be ended. In New York City, we must continue to hold the line that an expansion of the PIC is never okay, even when major organizations and funders support it. It is imperative to say that closing Rikers without new jails is the goal and fund housing instead. The creation of new jails is not an effective way to close a penal colony that itself was the consequence of reform. Instead, ending pretrial detention on a state level and passing serious bail reform, ending broken windows policing and slicing away the power of the corrections and police unions while defunding their institutions by half as soon as possible, will drastically reduce the numbers of people in jail in New York City. When we can decarcerate, why expand? Prisoner solidarity and mutual aid are two steps, but it will take strong collective principled actions that are not only limited to political elections and timelines. This is a serious moment to be in solidarity with Black, undocumented, trans, disabled, and poor criminalized communities in the city. And I feel we can rise to it. No one else is going to do it, and abolition as a framework insists we do it ourselves with incredible hope, discipline, and care. I'm looking forward to the strategies other panelists will offer. I will end with a note from Hakeem Trent L. in 2019 from a letter published in CUNY Law Review thanks to the efforts of Najat Guya. How would I spend $11 billion to shut down Rikers instead of on building new jails? The first thing I would focus my spending on would be the poverty within the communities. This means providing job training and job opportunities within New York for those who live in poverty. I would create programs that would give the masses the chance to learn how to cultivate the land and grow natural resources. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Vivian Trong. I wanted to first also thank the Asian American Feminist Collective for organizing this event. And I'm really humbled to be part of this panel with such amazing co-panelists. So I've been tasked with providing some historical context for Asian American organizing in New York City against police violence. So I wanted to take us back to 1995, which was a significant moment for this organizing among Asian American communities in New York City, and is the moment that this movement is building that I see as one of the predecessors to the current movement to defund the police. So 1995 was the second year of Rudy Giuliani's mayoral administration. And as many of us might know, Giuliani implemented zero tolerance and broken windows policing policies that really criminalized entire communities and led to an increase in cases of police violence. One of those cases occurred on March 24th, 1995, when a 16-year-old Chinese American, Yongshin Huang, was playing with a BB gun in his friend's backyard in Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn. And when a neighbor called the police because they thought that the boys were playing with a real gun, the police showed up to this friend's backyard and shot Yongshin Huang in the back of the head. And after his death, Yongshin Huang's sisters, Joyce and Qinglan Huang, organized alongside other families that had lost loved ones to police violence to demand justice So among them were Iris Baez, who is the mother of Anthony Baez, Margarita Rosario, who is the mother of Anthony Rosario, and on to Hilton Vega, Nicholas Hayward Jr., who is Nicholas Hayward Sr., who is Nicholas Hayward Jr.'s father. And these families worked closely with CAV, which was then known as the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, is now CAV Organizing Asian Communities, and the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights, which is now the Justice Committee, an organization that also still continues to organize alongside families of police violence victims. So the protest that I wanted to focus on today happened about a month after Yongshin Huang's death on April 25th, 1995. And I'll share some images from this protest. So this is an image of Yongshin Huang's mother outside of One Police Plaza, which is the police headquarters in New York City. So she was protesting alongside several of the families that I had just mentioned earlier. And at the same time, members of CAV and the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights were shutting down the entrance to the Manhattan Bridge in protest of all of these cases of police violence that happened in just the first 2 years of Giuliani's mayoral administration. One thing that's also important to note about this particular protest was that it wasn't just about policing. So this is a flyer from that protest on April 25th, 1995. And I think it speaks to what Saloni was talking about earlier in terms of the connections between these extreme or exceptional forms of violence and these lower forms of violence, because it was this protest happened the day before Giuliani released a budget that essentially proposed cutting $1 billion from social services that served low-income and marginalized communities in New York City, and essentially left the police and fire department budgets untouched. So it was the largest cut since World War II at that time. And what happened on April 25th is that several different organizations, including CAV, the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights, ACT UP, CUNY students, and others came together to address the budget. And I think it really has a lot of parallels with what we've been seeing over the past year in terms of the movement to defund the police and the way that budgets are these moral documents in terms of the allocation of resources to policing and punishment, and the slashing of social services that are really necessary for our communities. So at this protest, the organizers that were focusing on police violence shut down the Manhattan Bridge. Other organizers that were focusing on healthcare, particularly in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, were shutting down other bridges and tunnels, as well as CUNY students who were protesting the cuts to public education, as well as homeless organizers who were protesting cuts to employment, to housing, to other social services. So it was really this convergence of this coalition of people in New York City across race, across issue, age, gender, and sexuality. So I wanted to share these moments in New York City history to really kind of give this context for a movement that happened more than 2 decades ago now, but is this precedent for our movements today. And to really understand it as, these connections between these forms of slow and exceptional violence, and also to understand Asian Americans' role in this movement as well. That, just a month after the killing of Yongshin Huang on March 24th, 1995, that they were moving from their own understanding of how policing was affecting Asian American communities and not kind of this decontextualized solidarity that was about kind of like helping other communities of color, but really mobilizing communities that also have a stake in movements against policing. So in closing, I also wanted to talk about the use of history in the present moment. So one thing that I've noticed is that we often look to history to learn from a more radical past. So as Asian Americans, we often reference Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama and the movements of the 1960s and 70s. But I think one thing to really note is that the past year has really expanded what is possible in terms of the aftermath of the uprisings and the kind of entry of abolition as a national conversation. So if you look at history, I think a lot of the movements of the 60s and 70s were talking about policing in terms of a community control kind of framing. And as far as I know, kind of defund and abolish weren't really necessarily part of the popular discourse. So I think as we are looking to the past to learn these lessons, I think we also have to recognize how historic this moment is that we're living in right now, that you know, defund and abolish are even being talked about as viable possibilities. So we're really, I think, as Asian Americans at this crossroads where we're seeing the rise of the reactionary right on one hand, but also there are more and more Asian Americans that are really being politicized after this past summer's protests and also in the context of all of these attacks during COVID-19. And I think we really have this critical mass of people who are questioning whether the police are the solution to violence, which again, I think is really historic. So I actually wanted to kind of end on a quote by the scholar Naomi Murakawa, who in a recent interview said of Asian Americans, "We are deciding what to become." So I wanted to kind of leave with this question of, you know, in this moment when we have all of this energy and all this attention on this this issue of anti-Asian violence broadly defined, what do we do with all this energy that we've galvanized in this moment, and what do we want to become? So thank you, and with that, I'll pass it to Will.
Thank you, Vivian. It's great groundings from Mon and Vivian to segue into my discussion around Drum's work after 9/11. So again, my name is Will. I'm an organizer at Drum. My gender pronouns are he, him, or my name. I was raised, I'm from New York City, raised in New York City. I, grew up in New York post 9/11. So I also experienced some of the police violence that also happened, that I'll be sharing about that Drum saw post 9/11. So for those who don't know, Drum is a membership-led organization of working class, South Asian, and Indo-Caribbean community members based in New York City. We have memberships in all 5 boroughs, 4 boroughs, not in Staten Island. But our members are impacted by immigration, policing, surveillance. So we've had members who have experienced detention, deportation system, the incarceration system, surveillance. And our work is really to develop the leadership of the most impacted, most marginalized folks in our communities to fight for justice, racial, economic, and gender justice. Drum is an abolition aspiring organization. And I say that because while myself and probably all of the organizers work towards abolition, it is a process with our membership because we aren't ever our memberships come from different countries, in different backgrounds. Some were politicized at home, some were not. We're always recruiting new folks. So for us, abolition is a process with our membership in our communities. It's about really working to not just educate our folks, but show what society looks like without police and prisons, and doing what the material needs shifts that we need to, and the transformations in our community. So with that, so Drum has been involved from the beginnings with like groups like Critical Resistance, who is a national abolitionist organization. Our work has always been grounded against policing, against law enforcement that continue to oppress our communities, but especially recognizing the histories of targeting Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities in this country, and not just showing solidarity, but also actively working to dismantle the systems that oppress working class communities of color. After 9/11, it was really difficult for our membership. We have a largely Muslim membership, and we saw many of our members being targeted post 9/11. We saw families having loved ones being what we call disappearing, being sent to detention centers throughout the Northeast. And a lot of our work was to respond to the crisis, to respond to our communities being targeted, being attacked, being surveilled. And we spent a lot of our work in our early years was to organize to support families going through so much harm from like the law enforcement and the state. So a lot of our work was really in the beginning to do know your rights trainings to support folks to know what to do if immigration, law enforcement, and other forms of law enforcement, police came knocking on your door, engaging on the street. It was fighting against the special registration program, NSEERS, which was a registration program where if you're from a Muslim majority country, you're 16 years old and you're a male, you had to register as a Muslim. And, we had to really, coordinate with a lot of lawyers to help loved ones find folks in detention centers. So, something I want to share is like, we had a membership of about 900 during like the early years from like 2000 to 2004. Over 90% of our folks were deported. And, I want to emphasize that, like, that's how impactful, post 9/11 was, especially on our membership and Muslim, South Asian communities after 9/11. A lot of our work again was responding to the crisis. And then after, as we continued to, speak out, as we had our members speak out, and as society started seeing that, the disappearance, the sweeps were failing, the special registration was failing, and the critique by the media finally, we saw how the police and other law enforcement were shifting their tactics to more trying to engage faith institutions and community leaders and faith leaders about working with them to target their own people, right? That, to do the work to find the quote unquote right people, the quote unquote terrorists in their communities. And examples of that is like CVE program, Countering Violent Extremism, where using state government funding to give to community groups to basically rat on their communities and surveil their own people. So, our work during that time was to engage these community groups on and to intervene with community leaders on why they shouldn't do this. So we try to ground them in the history of what has happened with like Young Lords and Black Panthers around the infiltration of law enforcement and how they use it to sabotage our communities and target and harm our communities, and how that tactic is used over and over again. And then we also wanted to ground them like the police are not going to keep us safe. There is a history of this country of what the police have done. And, there wasn't as much success as we wanted with engagement because it was just folks were so engaged in the crisis right now. We did see the expansion of folks like wanting to engage with law enforcement at that time. However, it didn't stop us from our work of shifting towards focusing more on like how do we fight against and the police, not just NYPD, but immigration, against school policing, all these different forms that are targeting our peoples. and also against militarism. So I think for us, our grounding in abolition is also like, how are we also fighting against militarism? Because many of our folks migrate because of US and other Western involvement in their home countries, forcing like many times military dictatorships to come into power and forcing folks to migrate. And then also, the same tactics being used by the military is being used by police departments, the weapons, the technology, and the interconnectedness, and why it's important for us to, when we're organizing against the police, it's also like, how are we also thinking of the military aspect and militarism of it as well? So, and we continue doing that. And then, trying to go through a little bit of timeline, but then, we had Trump elected in 2016, right? And again, our membership was worried. Folks remembered what was happening post 9/11. Many, still had families who were deported at the time. It was a lot of concern, but what we led through several meetings with our members, we were able to ground them, and they were able to come to a realization that we actually want to protect each other. We want to work with other impacted communities to actually organize against the harm that we're going to see, to protect ourselves, to keep each other safe. So we started a community defense model with other impacted groups like other immigrant groups, Black, queer, trans folks, called Hate-Free Zones, a community defense model to where we fight against ICE, police, other law enforcement, other attacks in our communities. And through that, we did like know your rights trainings, self-defense trainings, anti-gentrification work, which included the fight against the building of Amazon's headquarters, second headquarters in Queens. But also work around how do we stop, hate violence that happens in our communities when it comes to the Islamophobia, the Asian hate violence, LGBTQ violence. Like, how do we actually like doing those trainings to ground us and like we keep each other safe, and we're going to counter white supremacy and other forms of systemic violence that we see. And for us, again, like it's interesting that this is called the title of today is like imagining a society without cops, but actually we can create it. I think we have to do the work to create it, and it's how we ground ourselves and engage our communities. And it is possible. There are groups doing it. There are folks on here who have been doing it, and we're gonna hear from more folks that have like other ideas and strategies. But it's like just that it's not about imagining; it's about creating it. And then I will pass it to Shahana.
Thank you so much, Will. Good evening, folks. I'm Shahana Hanif. It's a real honor to be here among some folks I really look up to, among giants. My political sharpening took place in movement spaces. So really just want to give a shout out to Vivian, who's here from CAV. So I've come from these spaces, including CAV, been a close ally to Daisy's Rising Up and Moving. So deep gratitude to you, Will. And of course, the Asian American Feminist Collective, and also groups that have endorsed my campaign earlier. For folks who are here early on, in my introduction, I am running for city council. And so it's an interesting and unique position to be in right now, to have these conversations. And so Vocal Action Fund, the New York Communities for Change, these are some groups that have aligned with the campaign that we're building, and they continue to be the hubs that I lean on as I put forth an agenda for the city that reflects care, co-governance, and movement accountability in our politics. A big part of actionable care for me is language justice and feminist. And as we expand restorative approaches to responding to conflicts, harm, and violence in our communities, the work must be done in our languages. And we must be committed to dismantling systems of exploitative and extractive economies. That is where the feminist analysis comes in, and center the leadership of women in impacted communities as frontline leaders of these conversations and strategies. One of the earliest platforms that we released is calling for a transformation of language justice in the city. And I'm explicit about calling it language justice and not language access, because leaving no one behind requires a shift in power and leadership. And I'll offer a definition that I really like that is offered by communities creating healthy environments in their language justice toolkit. And they write, language justice is an alternative to that historical pattern of disenfranchisement and oppression. Language justice is a process of organizing and advocating to win proactive policies that will help achieve equity and have meaningful impacts across race and language. Language justice offers a vision of society that honors language and culture as fundamental human rights, and which does not settle for providing more people access to the status quo, but rather alters institutions to provide space for full democratic participation. And so that's the kind of shift and transformation we're putting forth as we build this campaign for City Council. And I'll talk a little bit more about where I see the power of the City Council here in these conversations around defunding and abolition. So as organizers, it's up to us to strategize what a restorative approach can look like. And a part of that includes pushing elected officials to pass budgets that reflect care across adequate access to healthcare, housing, education, direct services for immigrants, youth, seniors, queer and trans communities. And almost everybody on this panel has raised all of that. And for folks who've been on the abolitionist journey, and I'm so grateful for the history and the historical context provided, I hope you're all taking care of yourself, because this is a long haul fight we've signed up for. And I hope you understand that the work we're doing is hard work. To see history repeated in this way is of course disappointing and frustrating, but I hope in this process you're taking care of yourself. For decades, we've seen our communities bearing the brunt of hate violence, and after the surges of attacks, hate crime task forces getting created, and other retributive punishments and policies that are passed by legislators. And what we've seen is they've done absolutely nothing. They've done absolutely nothing to abolish bigotry and hatred. And in fact, the retributive approach has also not made impacted communities feel safer. And so without systemic changes to policies in a country that was built on targeting, surveilling, and deporting and killing us, and the rise of right-wing forces attacking the working class, we will continue to live under threat. I'll share an example of what we've done in my district. I am running for City Council in Brooklyn in what is the 39th district. It includes the neighborhood I was born and raised in, Kensington, which is home to the largest working class Bangladeshi immigrant community in all of Brooklyn. And it's a district where we've encountered many incidences of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic attacks. Late last year, a group of Bangladeshi Muslim boys from Kensington were picked up by the local precinct for throwing eggs at Jewish neighbors. Of course, I reached out to the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office to demand accountability and not incarceration. And I also immediately brought together a coalition of neighbors and organizations to demand a community defense program that calls out the harmful attack and proactively supports our Jewish neighbors impacted and calls for restorative justice for the Muslim boys arrested. This coordination included DRUM. It included Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, that's JFREJ, and the New York City Commission on Human Rights, Center for Anti-Violence Education, and community leaders to educate our neighbors about the impact of hate and, in this case, anti-Semitism. And we put together materials in Bangla and Yiddish created by folks in our neighborhood and reviewed. One of the things that the city does not do when they do provide language access is there is no review mechanism. And so much of the materials that we read in our languages are unreadable. And so we have to scrap them. So the approach I've taken is how do we make sure that we're building up language access, rapid response teams within our own neighborhoods to do the political education work that we need, especially in cases like this. And so we sent out teams of Muslim and Jewish neighbors across Borough Park. We did not want outsiders doing this work. We were going to do this work. To speak to neighbors across Borough Park and Kensington, to share out palm cards and to speak with neighbors and businesses directly. Every single conversation we had at that moment, folks were receptive to the message of building a community that supports one another across boundaries, and that we have a responsibility to strengthen our neighborhood ties. There were challenging conversations, which spoke to the needs of community spaces that are lacking in these neighborhoods and across my district. Like the fact that there isn't a single youth center. And I'm speaking as somebody who was born and raised in Kensington. I'm 30 now, not a single youth center in Kensington. Or that divested schools don't offer counseling or after school programs, or there will be an after school program that gets cut. So there's no consistency or continuity of programming for young people, particularly young people of color. And so as a former city council staffer in the district I'm running in, I spent a lot of time building trust with grassroots arts and cultural organizations, and did a lot of matchmaking to secure additional funding to sustain positive programming and the intentional inclusion of impacted people as leaders in creating programming. I also focus on expanding parks and plaza infrastructure, because so many working class neighborhoods don't have access to open spaces, and I've emphasized the need for our communities to have power over the land, public spaces, and community gardens. I do not want outsiders, and especially not cops, patrolling these open spaces. So as part of our campaign, in addition to having this language justice platform, we're going to be releasing a platform on confronting hate. And it emphasizes funding restorative justice programs in public schools, like the Brooklyn Community Foundation's Brooklyn Restorative Justice 4-year pilot project, which reduced school suspensions and increased student well-being, to funding and expanding the Commission on Human Rights, New York City's Commission on Human Rights, where we should be filing complaints with. The reporting helps us as organizers to figure out more strategies on how we protect our seniors, queer folks, trans communities. Our platform also calls for the creation of frameworks for the Department of Transportation and community organizations to provide assistance and safety plans for faith-based institutions in advance of religious community events in public spaces, rather than relying on the NYPD for security. We've got to understand that the NYPD is not the only agency surveilling our communities. Countless city agencies like the Department of Transportation use the support of the PD to spy on us, to surveil us, to attack us. We're also pushing for a reboot of our city's 311 as a tool to provide coordinated care for individuals harmed by acts of violence. Our city should mobilize around those harmed and connect them with New York City Care. That's an initiative that we have for folks who are low income and undocumented, mental health services, meal delivery and housing. That is not one of the features of 311. Earlier today, I want to give a shout out to Vocal, and I'll wrap up. I joined their campaign, Caring and Compassionate New Deal, which calls for a $3 billion divestment from the PD's budget, and to invest in guaranteed housing and healthcare and nonviolence. What's happening? Nonviolence street teams to show up. And so we need to make sure that the next city council member is appropriately following the lead of organizations like Drum, like Vocal, that have put forth plans that are rooted by members. Membership-led based organizations have to lead. And then across the city, around the conversation of budgets, I'm a proponent of participatory democracy and participatory budgeting as a tool to democratize our city's budget. It's a collaborative tool I've seen that has brought in our undocumented community members, young people, to shape how we fund our neighborhoods, from climate justice projects to self-defense workshops. People have got to decide where the money goes. So I thank you all for listening to me, appreciate it, and just excited to continue to learn together.
Great. So I think I'm next, and I'm really excited to be here. So thank you, Asian American Feminist Collective, for having me. I think, coming after all of these amazing speakers, it makes my job easier. So part of what I want to talk about is bringing in intersectional, queer, and trans people of color lens to this conversation. And then I want to talk a little bit about why I don't think hate crimes laws keep us safe. And then I'm going to wrap up by kind of tying in how all of this fits into a broader framework around anti-Blackness. So I come to this work in terms of abolition as someone who is a queer Asian American who is part of a broader queer and trans people of color movement. And I think about people like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, and who are kind of leaders who are held up in the queer and trans liberation movement. And I think about in 1973 when Sylvia Rivera jumped on stage at the Christopher Street Liberation Day rally and grabbed the microphone when they wouldn't let her speak. And when she took the microphone, she talked about the struggles of queer and trans people in prison, in jail, who are incarcerated in cages. And so I think that there's a very long lineage of fighting against state violence and connecting the struggles around hate, bias, discrimination to these larger systems and structures that are interconnected, that oppress marginalized communities. And I also want to uplift the work that people like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson did. Before it was called mutual aid, they did mutual aid work. And queer and trans, Black and brown communities have always done the work of keeping our community safe, right? They provided housing for our communities when we were pushed out of our homes, thrown into the streets. It's queer and trans, Black and brown people who took care of each other as sex workers, who continue to do that work today. And so I also want to acknowledge the work of coalitions like Decrim New York, Red Canary Song, Sylvia Rivera Law Project, Black Trans Nation, GLITZ, Colectivo Intercultural Transcretiento. There's so many organizations that are Black and brown trans led who are doing this work today and are able to speak for themselves. In terms of hate crimes, it's not a new thing. None of this is new. Hate crimes legislation has been on the books since 1968. It was expanded in 1988, then 1996, and then again in 2009 through the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. And I want to acknowledge the work of Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which put out multiple statements on why hate crimes legislation does not keep our community safe. It individualizes the harm, it erases broader systems that produce the violence that we do see. And so it doesn't address the root causes of violence in our communities. And there's so many other things that our communities need in order to be safe. And so when we talk about why hate crimes do not make us safer, hate crimes laws do not make us safer, we have to acknowledge that police show up after the fact, after the harm has been done. They issue press releases, the media circulates, the police statements, and then the police use these horrific tragedies in our communities to demand more money for their bloated budgets, right? Billions and billions and billions of dollars. As someone who grew up in New York City in a working class immigrant family, I know what violence looks like. And I grew up in New York City in the 80s and 90s. And many people of color who come to the work of abolition come from communities that have experienced harm in many different ways, including through quote unquote crime. And so I say that because abolition is not just a theoretical, idealistic, intellectual exercise, but it's something that I come to as someone who sees family members reflected in the stories of people who are vulnerable to violence, including elders who are doing recycling work who have been harmed. And so when we think about criminalization and hate crimes prosecution, what does that actually do? Because when we talk about safety, people say, well, what about the victims? And what will keep us safe? The reality is the current system of policing and mass incarceration has not kept us safe. And the billions of dollars that we put into that system does nothing for the victims or the families of the victims who have been harmed. And I want to highlight that, one of the stories here in New York City was an 83-year-old Asian grandmother, Nancy To, who was knocked unconscious. And when she later spoke to a reporter, she said that she was afraid to go to the hospital because she couldn't afford medical care. Policing, hate crimes prosecution, none of that addresses the underlying issues. The fact that she didn't have health care, right? Another case more recently, Yao Pan Ma, who was brutally beaten in East Harlem and is currently in a coma in the hospital, 61 years old. He was collecting recyclables. He came to the United States 2 years ago, worked as a dishwasher, lost his job during COVID. He didn't qualify for unemployment, and that's why he was on the street collecting cans to support his family to pay the rent. So we have to ask ourselves, how did our government and society fail here? What made our elders vulnerable to this violence? What would a real safety net look like, regardless of immigration status? For workers who work in the restaurant economy, who are forced to jump through hurdles that make it impossible to qualify for any of the relief programs that are available. Hate crimes laws does nothing to address any of those issues. And it doesn't even try, right? And so as Mon said earlier, what can we do with $11 billion to shut down Rikers and stop building new jails? I'll up the ante. What if we also threw in another $10 billion from the NYPD budget? What could we do with $21 billion a year in New York City alone to invest in our communities, to make our communities safer, to address root causes of violence? So the last point I want to make is around anti-Blackness. So many of the stories that get circulated in the media involve harm that is between a Black and an Asian person, right? And how many of you have heard of the name Shane Nguyen? Shane was recently killed brutally by 3 white men in Indiana. I haven't seen any headlines. It's not on CNN. It's not front page news. If it had been Black men who killed Shane, I guarantee you it would have been. And the reason why I bring this up is because we have to recognize when our pain, our trauma, our stories are being weaponized and used for an agenda that is not about keeping us safe. And those stories that get circulated play into a certain narrative around Black criminality. It feeds into Black versus Asian conflict. And so when there are stories that do not fit into those narratives, for example, with Shane Nguyen, the media is silent. And so why is it that the media only covers anti-Asian violence when it feeds into anti-Blackness? So we have to keep our eyes open. And we have to acknowledge that, part of the challenge is that we've been conditioned to reach for more policing, more criminalization and incarceration as the quote unquote solution. But that's not justice. We know that criminalization of people who commit harm is not justice. We know that's not the case for George Floyd. It's not the case in incidents of anti-Asian violence. We, all of us, deserve the kind of justice that transforms the conditions and systems that allow for acts of violence and killing to be possible. So I'm going to end there. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Kalayan, who is one of my friends, and I'm thrilled to be here with him.
Thank you so much, Jason. And thank you so much, everyone who has shared and spoken. And most especially, thank you to the Asian American Feminist Collective for bringing us together in this space. My name is Caligan Mendoza, and my pronouns are he, him, and sha. I'm the US Programs Director at Nonviolent Peace Force. I'm currently based in St. Paul, Minnesota, the ancestral lands of the Chedisacoin and Anishinaabe people. My work here has been primarily to bring in unarmed civilian protection methodologies to protect the community from state and non-state actor violence, both in the lead up to the Derek Chauvin trial and in the after the murder of Dante Wright. What we saw on the ground was the egregious use of state violence against protesters, against the community, flooding the neighborhood with poison, quite frankly. Poisons that are banned in use of warfare, but can be used by the state against unarmed civilians. The work that we do at Nonviolent Peace Force really comes from learning the lessons from our partners in the global South. For instance, in South Sudan, we have women protection teams. And I know a lot of folks probably on the call right now and who are part of organizations building out the capacity for community protection, community defense, are trying to figure out how do we create something that is not grounded in a carceral anti-Black model, a model that is used by vigilante groups like the Guardian Angels, a model that further criminalizes our Black relatives and neighbors. So it's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, right? And I remember a time when we would celebrate it by having sharing our food and our cultural dances. And it continues to dawn on me that in this white settler colonial state, we are not, and nor have we ever been safe. We continue to see the rise of violence against our communities, against all communities of color, by white supremacist state and non-state actors. And the question is, what the hell do we do? How do we utilize and this pain to protect our people? And one thing I've learned is community safety, community care, mutual protection are all ancestral gifts. These are the only ways that our peoples have been able to survive genocide, colonization, and many of them did not survive, but that's what was passed on to us. Coming from a place of solidarity, not charity, coming from a place of care and not dominance. When we look to how do we keep us safe from violence, it needs to be in community-based solutions. And there's numerous examples of this. I just wanted to introduce a couple tools that we utilize at Nonviolent Peace Force when working with human rights defenders in the Global South and here. The first one is called a risk assessment. I invite folks to utilize this tool. You can find it on our website, but and it'll be in the chat box as well. The risk assessment is basically you're identifying what are the likely harms to your community, vulnerabilities, what are the gaps in your safety and capacities, what are the resources or strengths that you have, and what are the ones that you need. This model can be utilized for building cross-community solidarity and even imagining what does a solidarity and safety group look like made up of BIPOC folks. I know for me, as much as I appreciate our white accomplices, they don't understand what safety looks like for my community. There is a I don't want to say a fracturing, but there is a gap in that. So I invite folks to utilize a risk assessment the next time you're with your pod, the next time with your organization. Once again, it's identifying your risks. What are the likely harms to yourself or your community? Vulnerabilities. What are the weaknesses or gaps in ensuring your safety and security? And capacities. What are the resources and strengths that you have within your community? And what are the ones that you need in order to strengthen your vulnerabilities? The next tool I want to introduce is something called the OODA loop. It is used for situational awareness. Whether we're on the ground whether I'm on the ground with folks in New York supporting Queen Jean and Joella for the weekly Stonewall protests, or here in the Twin Cities, we utilize the situational awareness to be able to identify likely threats and their plan around that. The way it's broken down is using the acronym OODA, that stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. When you're in observation mode, you are calm, cool, collected, and connected. You're able to take in as much information in your environment and within yourself. When you're in orientation mode, what you're doing is you're identifying baselines. What is considered normal, quote unquote normal, for this situation for a person. Next is the D in OODA is decide. You're coming up with your plan based on the baseline and the identified anomalies. What are you going to do? Are you going to be, are you in an upstander intervention mode, or are you in a self-protection mode? And then lastly is to act. And most folks are like, yeah, this, I use this every time I go into the subway, or use this whenever I'm walking around. And we definitely do. It's important to look at this as a cognitive shortcut to be able to fall back on when you're pushed out of your window of tolerance, when you're no longer calm, cool, collected, or connected, when you are pushed into a fight or flight or freeze or fawn state. And once again, OODA stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. I know it's super quick. The link to the tools, the workbook that we use with community safety teams here in the Twin Cities is included in the chat. And I think one thing that I want to commit to for this Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month is reimagining what does safety look like for our communities, not from a place of carceral punishment, not from a place of white settler colonial state dominance, but from a place of joy, from a place of radical joy. Because if there's one thing that is clear to me, last year, I live in Jackson Heights, and we were the epicenter of the epicenter. I remember watching body bags being put in refrigeration trucks like everyone else, and not knowing what would happen to us, and feeling that the state had left us behind. There was a reiteration that we are the ones that keep us safe. And we saw mutual aid groups spring up. We saw people put themselves and their health on the line when we didn't have a vaccine, when we didn't know how, whether the air outside was going to be poisoned to us. So I know that we have the ability to keep us safe. White supremacy is on its last pillars. It's falling apart. The old world is dead and a new world is rising. And together we can build a world that's based in justice, a world that's based in joy, and a world that's outside of the clutches of the white settler colonial state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're now actually going to be transitioning into our Q&A portion. So if anyone has any questions you have for the panelists, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A box. First, I want to just say thank you all so much. I personally have learned so much in the last hour and a half. So just want to thank you again. So the first question that we're just going to start off with is, what are some of the community learnings that we can offer to each other right now, specifically, between 9/11 and now? And I know, Will, you talked a little bit about this, but I think there's so much that we can learn from each other in this moment from our history. So I would love to just throw that out there, and maybe first to Will and then open it up to the group.
Yeah. So I think for me, when I think about right now, like I think it's how are we fighting for and the material needs for our communities. And I think Jason brought us up, especially around immigrant folks, like especially elders, like you're speaking of like elders who didn't have healthcare, right? So how are we fighting for material needs? So, and the resources for our communities, right? So for example, in New York State, Drum and other groups fought the Fund for Excluded Workers, right? So a fund from for many excluded workers, especially undocumented workers, sex workers, and other excluded workers, to have some type of financial compensation during this pandemic. So how are we also working for getting rent canceled, right? Like the racial and not just racial justice, but also economic justice and the gender justice, right? So how are we also like creating community-based interventions when it comes to like gender-based violence in our community? So Drum has been experimenting with that with our membership. We've trained members to be able to intervene when and support survivors, and also figure out strategies to hold in a non-punishment punitive way harm doers accountable, right? And going through a process. And then again, it's experiments, right? But we have to be willing to experiment. We have to be willing to fail, right? Not everything is going to work right away, but it's the only way we really get to that cop-free society, that society that without the reliance on police and prisons and detentions, is really experimenting, is really working with each other, and again, grounding in terms of like, how are we fighting for the material needs?
Thank you so much, Will, for that. And yeah, Mon, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, I think one of the community learnings that I think Will just attested to, but I kind of will build on, is that just because something happened doesn't mean the fight is over. And I think it's a huge lesson around a lot of, I mean, a good example, I think, on the state level is bail reform. Like currently in New York State, the assumption is that bail has been reformed. But there's actually a lot more work that should and could happen to actually reform bail to the level that like it would actually mean that people were getting out in larger amounts and we weren't needing to construct jails. Not that we ever need to construct jails, but by the logic of the New York State. So both in like that example, or even with the jails, you know, a lot of people were involved when the Euler process was happening around the jails, but after that process ended with a city council vote where they decided to build the jails, I think like the general energy, not even just from organizers on the ground, changed. And I think it's because sometimes it feels like the bad thing happened, so we like can't keep organizing. Like that was the thing we were organizing for, but actually, usually, I think a big community learning is that you can keep going. Like nobody said that that was the end.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone else want to jump in before we move on?
I can just add a quick note. Something that I've also been thinking about is how none of this organizing, this work is new. And there's so many groups that have been doing this for a long time, organizations like Drum, CAB, and so forth. And I think for a lot of us who are trying to plug in now, there's a set of questions that Mariam Kaba put out, and I'm going to put it in the chat and read it. It's what resources exist so I can better educate myself? Who's already doing work around this injustice? Do I have the capacity to offer concrete support and help to them? And how can I be constructive? And I think these questions are really helpful because we don't necessarily need people to recreate the wheel or to do what some of the celebrities are doing, and they want to speak out, but they haven't necessarily grounded their analysis and the demands in the community. When we've been building for generations and decades, an analysis instead of demands around what we know keeps us safe in the investment that we need in our communities. And so we've seen organizations here in New York City and the Bay Area organize and put out responses laying forth the need to invest in our communities. And so I would say support those organizations that are already doing that work. You don't need to take the microphone from them.
Definitely. I think that's actually a really good segue into some of the questions that we're seeing in the chat, which is, you know, as people are getting more galvanized, and also, you know, what's happening right now is actually making a lot of people kind of think about some of these things for the first time. And what would you all say in terms of strategies for kind of beginning these conversations with folks who clearly do not believe, what we're thinking or don't believe that this is possible? How do you converse with them? Like, what are your strategies that you can share with us? While y'all are thinking on that, I see that another question that's actually kind of similar in terms of explaining this vision for cop-free communities to people who currently fear for their safety. Kind of similar to the first question of like, it feels hard to balance the long-term vision with the immediate need to be safe. So I think it's also just another question of how to kind of articulate the vision to people who might not be thinking about this or have a lot of questions or are fearing for their safety and don't think that this is feasible or just pushing back.
Yeah, I think these are hard questions. And I think one place that I would start too is this question of like whether the police keep our community safe in the first place. And I think one of the things that has come up for me as I've been kind of like seeing this wave of news of cases of anti-Asian violence is that the same populations that are subject to this wave of anti-Asian violence have also been subject to police violence. So if we think about Yang Song and how massage parlor workers have been subjected to violence from both like police and non-police actors. There's also been several attacks. I'm most familiar with the New York City context, but in the past years of police attacking like elderly Asian folks, including Kang Wong in 2014, who was at the time an 84-year-old who was stopped for jaywalking, and he tried to walk away because he didn't know how to communicate with the cops, and he ended up being bloodied. There's another case in Chinatown that happened in 2012 when a noise complaint was called in for musicians that were playing in Columbus Park in Chinatown. So this, starting with this question of like, what do the police actually do? And for I think Jason also brought this up for like those of us who have experienced violence, right? Like, have the police stepped up in any of those cases and protected us, right? So I think really kind of like asking those kinds of questions and really kind of getting at where the fear comes from and whether the solutions that are the kind of like knee-jerk reactions like actually address the issues that we're raising up.
I can give an example of some recently a couple of years ago when Drum was part of the No New Jails fight. So and our members are really sharp when it comes to abolishing ICE, right? Because many are impacted, have been impacted, or have family members impacted by the detention deportation system. And so when we saw, that this fight was coming up around the jail expansion in New York City, we were like, no, like, for us as organizers, we had to do the work to engage our membership. At first there was a lot of pushback. They're like, because of the perception of jails, right? Well, in jails, there's the quote unquote criminals are in jail, right? So we also did some grounding in terms of history of policing in this country, history of jails, but also like examples of like uplifting the stories of what happened with Khalif Browder and other folks who have seen what has happened in jails and connecting it to actually understanding the origins of the deportation and detention system is in jails, right? And the history of jails and policing in this country. So through the work of different education workshops or our membership, almost unanimously our membership voted to be part of the No New Jails fight. And again, these are not folks that come from like abolitionist backgrounds, right? But they understood, right, the connections between what was happening to Black and Black immigrant communities and Latinx communities and connections to policing and to jails. And they were showing out, testifying at city council, going to rallies, us having a rally in every one of our bases to oppose the jail plan to our council members. It's a learning process. And I go back to abolition as a process, right? Like you will get pushback, and it's how you ask folks the questions, right? Why is so much money being spent to incarcerate and cage people? But then there's continuous cuts to housing, to healthcare, to everyday needs for our communities. And then how are we supposed to survive if that's the case?
Thank you so much, Will. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm gonna kind of just put all the questions together and everyone choose what you want to talk about, okay? Okay, so thoughts on bystander, upstander training that we may be facing or witnessing other being harmed, just thoughts on it. I know there's a lot of different models, like any, strategies that you have for folks who are thinking about that. I know, Kalayan, you've been talking a little bit about that. And then how do we hold harm doers accountable if they don't want to participate in restorative justice, especially when they cause great bodily harm or even death? And then another question for those who have been in fights with, government or even nonprofit spaces, how do you navigate kind of the respectability or even strategies of being within the system, but still trying to push change in institutions or places that might not be as receptive to those ideas? Yeah, feel free to go for it. One person, and then we'll close out each person. Yeah.
I'll go hella quick. Hollaback has been doing some amazing work in New York and nationally. I invite folks to check out their work if they haven't already. Nonviolent Peace Force has been doing community safety trainings here in the Twin Cities with the AAPI community and with BIPOC communities across the two cities. Check out the website for more information, or if you're looking to just like dive deeper into it, I would recommend shoot me a DM at Kala Mendoza on Instagram, and I can get you resources. Check.
Julie, did you want us all to answer, or did you want kind of just like one by one?
One by one, last thoughts on those questions, or whatever your last thoughts are.
Yeah, I can share some last thoughts. I think that this is a question, I think that these questions come up a lot, like in any abolition-oriented webinar or study or political group or anything. And I guess what I would say is that there are a lot of models and there's a lot of resources, but I would also say that it's not like these are easy questions to answer. And I definitely agree with what Will said around abolition being a process and also being a framework, because we are all also in the process of trying to answer these questions and trying to learn together what the models are. I really admire when people learn to become street medics, or when they learn how to be peer support therapists, or when they learn how to do mutual aid in their communities or do childcare. There's just so many different kinds of models. Shahan brought up language justice. I think people who offer translation for their communities as a way of intervening in violence. And there's organizations doing that. But I feel like what I would kind of end on is that there's not necessarily simple answers for any of the questions, and there's no simple models. People have spent decades and centuries trying to answer those questions. And I feel like, yeah, I just kind of want to end on that note, that it's one thing to expect people to be able to have the answers for that, but it's also another thing to try and join them and trying to figure it out.
I can go next just to build on that, because I think part of the issue is we have to change everything. And I'm looking forward to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book, Change Everything. So keep an eye out for that. I think sometimes, when we talk about violence, it's such a narrow frame. And that's why policing is seen as the response. If there is interpersonal harm, the police come in and stop it. But really, these issues arise because of housing injustice, inequality, mental health, homelessness, all of these different things compound itself. The pandemic, right? People are experiencing a lot of trauma during this time. And so I think that we have to change everything. We have to build intersectional solidarity, which I think movements are doing a better job of linking the struggles across issues, across communities. And I want to just push back a little bit on the question around immediate needs, because I think a lot of times those questions are posed to abolitionists, but those are not questions posed to the police. So why are we holding a higher standard instead of questions that kind of have a rhetorical, like utopian skepticism of abolition that we don't hold up policing to? Because policing has not created a utopian society when we've done what we've done for generations, decades, and centuries, and we've poured billions and billions of dollars into the status quo. That's not working. And so part of what we're doing is reimagining, building new institutions, and thinking through how we can actually invest in communities to address violence at the root cause.
So I can also respond maybe quickly to the questions in the chat about interracial solidarity. I think a lot of the questions that Jason shared in the chat earlier about like who is already doing the work are helpful for thinking through this question as well, because I do think that organizations like Drum and CAV and some of the other groups that we've been talking about have already kind of been making these connections between different communities of color when it comes to issues like policing or housing or healthcare and a various kind of, a variety of different issues. And I think it's less about kind of like proving to other communities of color that Asian Americans or Asian immigrants that our communities experience violence or are oppressed, and more about, showing up and doing the work in our own communities.
Will, did you want to see a final thing before we end?
Sure, I feel like I took up a lot of space already, but yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's also shifting our understandings. I think also around like we're so focused on a society of punishment, right? Also that that when harm is caused in different ways, like we think of we need to punish somebody. And many times when folks say accountability and justice, it's about punishment. And also how we shift our understandings of how we deal with harm and intervene when harm happens. And I think many times, and especially like, as we're seeing, a lot of discussions around anti-Asian violence right now, I think we also like have to like, and that many times that's what folks turn to is it's like an idea of punishment and punishment through this criminal punishment system, right? So it's like how we also like shift our understandings around that. And again, I think many times hearing from and hearing from the voice of those directly impacted, right? Caged folks and folks who've been through the criminal punishment system, I think really helps to ground us all.
Thank you. I just want to say that I'm really excited by the fact that we're all getting together. I think a lot of the times the first thing to do is just making sure that we're talking to each other, and like Asian American groups are learning from each other and staying in solidarity through this time so that we can make sure we're all like, doing this work, in a way that's in solidarity. So I just want to say thank you all so much for being here tonight and being a part of this conversation. I think that we can also, for folks who are more interested in the conversations that we're having, I think plugging into existing efforts, existing groups, like some of, like a PIMNI, Drum, CAV, I know a lot of them have been listed in the chat, but getting involved in the organizations that are in existence and are doing some of this work already is a really great way to at least get started. And for us, you know how to follow us on Twitter, Instagram. We have a YouTube now. Like, this is like, I think, our first live video. So we're really thankful to all of you. And we have Saloni, Rachel, Tiffany, who's been doing a lot of the back end stuff, and Senti, who's also here, have all contributed to this. Just want to shout out the entire collective. And yeah, thank you everyone again. The recording is going to be on the YouTube, and share it. And thank you for